about the inspiration for his latest drama. With some strong language, know your enemy.
I like stories of missed opportunities, as you know, especially crucial ones.
Stephen Poliakoff's Close to the Enemy shines an intense light on a dark side of Britain's wartime history.
Supersonic speed is the only thing that matters at the moment. Breaking the sound barrier. Boom.
So nothing else matters. That will always take precedence, being ready for the next war.
Stopping the next war.
What interests me is how do we enter history? How do we go back in time?
Because nobody's allowed to talk about who did what, about what some of us really saw, really did. It's such bad form.
Want to hear more?
Of course, Mr. Lindsay-Jones. Although it's not quite clear to me what it is you want me to do.
I wouldn't claim to be a dedicated seeker after truth. I'm creating fiction.
As a historian who's presented programs for television and radio, I'm fascinated by the tension between historical fact and dramatic fiction.
But I know some things very few other people do about what really went on. How we could have won the war before it had even started. How none of this need have happened. Stories about some of the highest people in the land and what they actually got away with.
What lessons can historians learn from a writer-director like Stephen Poliakoff, who's opened up neglected areas of history for millions of viewers? Is the historian at odds with the dramatist, or are we both approaching truth from different yet complementary angles? Set in the immediate aftermath of World War II, Close to the Enemy follows the enigmatic intelligence officer Callum Ferguson, who has a morally ambiguous assignment.
So, you've seen the little girl?
Yes. I've done your babysitting for you.
Good. But I want you to do a little more babysitting of a rather more important kind instead.
Oh, who do you want me to babysit?
He's a scientist or an engineer. I never know what the correct term is when you're talking about high speed. A jet plane man, anyway. Speaks quite good English. Shouldn't be difficult.
No, what's the problem?
He doesn't want to work with us. We had to move fast before the Russians got him. We snatched him out of bed in the middle of the night, in fact. Though I'm sure we did it in as civilized a way as possible.
Oh, of course.
But he's a little bit irritated with us, nonetheless. Maintains he won't cooperate with us under any circumstances. You've got to make him change his mind.
One of the central themes of the series is the role of T-Force, T for target, targeting German scientists, bringing them out, denying them to the Russians, using them to advance British economy and security and so on. That's probably a rather surprising take on 1946 for most British viewers who would be thinking more in terms of nationalisation or the beginnings of the NHS and so on. Was this something you really wanted to use to twist British sensitivities here?
I think it is very interesting. We think of, and quite rightly, I think, in many ways, that the fabled Attlee Labour government is rather this wonderful saintly government in many ways. But they had a very, very tough foreign policy. I mean, they wanted a nuclear bomb, as Ernest Bevin said, with a Union Jack on it. They were absolutely determined to be a great power still. If they could, we were completely broke. So there was literally grabbing of human assets, which seems a very un-British thing, that we were actually seizing people and bringing them over. And I'd never seen that dramatised anywhere. And I thought that was fairly extraordinary in itself and part of our history.
The only hot toffee around.
And it's right on our doorstep. Isn't that a bit of luck?
You seem to think the way to get me working for you through my daughter's stomach.
More important than all of that was the moral equation between the country being protected versus making people answerable for crimes against humanity.
Shall I have one, but only one?
Callum Ferguson's mission sets him up against a team of dedicated investigators with very different priorities.
You from T-Force?
And who are you?
Sorry. I'm Kathy Griffiths from the War Crimes Unit. Haven't answered my question. We know T-Force is using the hotel to entertain people of interest, so I just thought you might be from T-Force.
We had an enormous amount of information gathered, which we did not share with people that were looking for Nazi war criminals. Though the Nuremberg trial was going on and the top Nazis had been arrested, were being held and were being tried, thousands of other potential suspects were let go for a variety of reasons. So that moral equation between protecting the country and the natural justice was why I was so
you're putting your finger here on something that is historically significant in that hinge moment in 1946. In other words, when we move from World War to Cold War and we start deciding that people who were our enemies are now potential allies.
That only a year ago, crimes were being committed. People were being murdered on an unimaginable scale in camps. And yet somehow it seems that that's just a side issue for nearly everybody. Not remotely as serious as beating the Russians or getting ahead of the Americans.
The Soviet Union is a real threat right at this moment, far more than people realize. And I know from my own personal experience how terrible it is if we're not ready for that.
So nothing else matters. That will always take precedence, being ready for the next war.
Stopping the next war.
You're also, in a sense, touching on something that's a larger, almost universal story in history, that sense of how time moves on and the enemy from the last war can become the ally in the future and so on. Were you thinking in those universal terms as well?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's one of the perennially difficult questions, that one's enemy then turns into the useful friend. I mean, God knows what's going to happen in Syria, but I mean, in our very recent history, we were about to bomb Assad, and then suddenly we thought, well, maybe a few months later we might be in alliance with him against ISIS.
I don't know why we have to do this, treating them like film stars to try to make them work for us. We won the fucking war, didn't we? They were the enemy until last year, sir. Till a few months ago. I'm sorry, sir, excuse me. It just makes my blood boil. It isn't right.
Well, it is if it works.
So you've got, on the one hand, a sort of realpolitik view of things, which says, OK, we need now to think about the national interest in a new situation. And then the other is a moral view.
Why did I choose Cal as my hero? It's almost like our perspective. If we'd been in the war and we'd seen all these hopeless things happen, we would be we're not going to be caught out like that again. Cal is the man that is trying to defend the national interest, as it were, the national security. And I wanted to make that a very valid point of view so that the moral equation was complicated.
No, I have my own personal reasons for being here.
Because of the war, obviously.
No, not in the way that you might think. We should never have been so badly equipped when the war broke out. Oh, and it's not going to happen again. So you see, there is nothing I won't do to make this work. Nothing.
Poliakoff is preoccupied by some big historical questions, but these are explored through the emotional lives of his characters.
I'm going to show you your rather pokey little office now, Dieter.
What interests me is how do we enter history? How do we go back in time? I think the best way to go back in time is to sort of feel you're there yourself.
Yes, absolutely.
And face difficult choices or moral. You're attracted to your best friend's wife. Are you going to sleep with her? That is a situation that everybody, can think, should he, shouldn't he?
Callum and Rachel's affair is just one of a series of moral dilemmas in Close to the Enemy, where everyone seems to be struggling with their own internal conflicts.
Well, we can't do this, can we?
Why? Because a Nazi slept in here. We can't use the bed. Come on.
Well, that is another reason, of course, but rather more importantly, because Alex is your best friend.
Well, Alex is your husband.
That's also true.
This interest in the moral dilemmas of characters But all that is intensified by the experience of war, isn't it? I mean, this is these moral choices become more existential, more life and death, if you like, in a situation of war.
Yes, I think that what interests me is what if you'd been there, witnessed this? That seems to me very fascinating.
Is that part of what attracts you to the war period as a dramatist, leaving aside the history, if you like?
Yes, because it's probably the biggest thing that happened to this country in the last 100 years. That the Second World War was such a huge, huge event. And we are infamous in Europe for still going on about the war. But I'm going on about the war, I suppose, from a different angle.
Setting the drama in 1946 gives Poliakoff a different vantage point on the war, when the bombing has stopped, but the scars of conflict are still vivid. The bombed-out landscape is a central feature of this series. We keep coming back to it in front of the Conington Hotel, all the rest of it. Was that something that was central to what you wanted to evoke about 1946?
Yes, I mean, that was one of the central images. I mean, I was born in December 1952, so my first memories are of being driven through London by my dad, and I can remember the bomb sites. I can remember how shattered London still looked, and that must have been 10 years after the end of the war. And because of these memories, I felt a connection to that devastation.
The faded grandeur at the Conington Hotel provides an evocative, claustrophobic backdrop for Poliakoff's characters as their lives become increasingly entwined.
There are all sorts staying here, sir, yes, because it is quite cheap, but they don't all look like that.
I thought that it was a very good setting for people coming together and trying to rebuild their lives. But also, I liked the idea of emphasizing the semi-militarized nature of society immediately after the war.
The military took over this hotel.
Well, the military was still there, you know. They'd taken over all these schools, they'd taken over these stately homes. They didn't get out immediately.
It's our secret floor. I think I can safely say nobody in the hotel knows about it, except for the 2 or 3 that have to know, of course. And we have the capacity to listen to several rooms where we park people who are interested. Can monitor who they're talking to, what they're saying, what they're thinking.
Yes, we did a lot.
So that moment of transition fitted with them sort of running a hotel, or making uses of a hotel, fitted with this grabbing of scientists in Germany, because it was all to do with the military, the government and the secret services still calling the shots.
As Britain cleared the bomb sites and started to rebuild its city, some people began to ask tough questions about who was responsible.
It's a story about the beginnings of the Cold War, and also about the rage that people felt at the time when they tried to rebuild their lives, at how things had ended up. I mean, they could not switch off the adrenaline, whether it's from combat or from the terror of being bombed from above. They couldn't just switch that off. Legacy of the run-up to war as well, how incredibly unprepared we were, all the mistakes that were made in the 30s, when the mist of victory had cleared, staring at this incredible destruction and wondering how it could have happened.
I mean, one of the things that's striking about Cal is he says at one point, I like stories of missed opportunities, especially crucial ones.
Yes.
And it seems like that he's almost talking for you there, isn't he?
Yes, I think that's a very, very good point. I think he is. I mean, there are two crucial opportunities in the story that Cowell is referring to. One is the story of the jet engine. Which is a terrible story of a missed opportunity. That Frank Whittle invented the jet engine. He was a very, very young guy, and he had very, very little support from the government. The leading German jet engine specialist after the war said that if Brits had pursued Whittle's plans more vigorously, Hitler would not have taken Britain on, because he would have doubted the Luftwaffe would prevail.
I know you worked for Mr. Frank Whittle before the war on his invention and development of the jet engine.
And you saw at first hand the terrible obstacles and indifference that he encountered, and what that led to. Am I right?
You could be.
Now, it is possible that I saw some things myself in the circles I move in that could be of interest to you, Mr. Ferguson.
The second missed opportunity of the drama is a little-known footnote of history. it may come as much of a shock to the viewer as it does to Cal.
In the summer of '38, a very neatly dressed German diplomat came to visit the Foreign Office. This was before the war, remember. He's carrying a message from senior figures in the German military that they would launch a military coup against Hitler. But they just wanted one guarantee from us. They needed us to say publicly we would go to war with Germany if Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. Just for us to say it, and then they would act.
So the whole war could have been avoided.
Let's talk about what seems to be the crucial missed opportunity, voiced in the series by Harold, the retired Foreign Office official. But he is, in a sense, speaking for you, isn't he? Or is that too crude a way of putting it?
No. In that case, he's not really, I think, because Harold obviously is a fictional character.
Yes, I know.
But I was really intrigued that what if my fictional character, unlike some of the people at the time, had been haunted by that missed opportunity. Yeah. The fact is that it is very, very little known that this happened. I mean, you're one of the few historians that take that plot seriously.
Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's determination to appease Hitler meant that he ignored other messages coming from Germany.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. We regard the agreement signed last night as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Chamberlain has gone down in the history books as the man who failed to stop Hitler in the run-up to war. But there was another figure that Poliakoff depicts as culpable, Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax.
Say both of them had enormous flaws, Chamberlain and Halifax, and certain strengths at other times. Of course, they weren't complete, inept villains.
Why Halifax particularly as the kind of bearer of this iniquity?
Well, now I'm a bit personally obsessed with Lord Halifax, but why I chose him, A, because I wanted his fictional character to be in the Foreign Office and not working at Number 10, because the failures of the Foreign Office, historically, I don't think have ever really been faced up to. I mean, you don't see lots and lots of books about how useless the Foreign Office was, but the terrible mistakes were made.
Crucially for Poliakoff, Halifax was not only head of the Foreign Office, he was also a member of the British landed aristocracy. I mean, we could argue about this Halifax versus Chamberlain, but in a sense, most people watching your series would have expected Chamberlain to be the sort of the devil here, but for you, Halifax is also representative of a kind of an English upper class that's part of the problem.
Well,
is that
right?
right?
I think that incredible nonchalant upper class attitude, the arrogance of the upper class running the country from their big houses, the amateur nature of a lot of our leaders, I think is something that I'm getting at through Halifax.
This theme of the particular responsibility of the aristocracy and appeasement, that's a kind of recurrent theme that you're concerned about.
Now then, when we've got all of our flags pinned up, I think we should have a little bit of a sing-song. Sing-song.
In Poliakoff's earlier drama, Glorious 39, Romola Garai plays a young woman who makes a terrifying discovery about her upper-class family in the summer before the war.
Oh, I didn't know. What I found out is that there's a group of them in the Secret Service and a motley collection of other people, including some very determined aristocrats who are trying to bring this war to an end before it's even started. They think we haven't got a chance, and they're determined to do a deal with Hitler.
I think they killed my friend Gilbert, and they blackmailed Hector.
And they are very dangerous, yes.
In Glorious 39, I wanted to show, I mean, there were, as we know, several aristocrats who had fascist sympathies. The anti-Semitism, particularly amongst the ruling class and aristocracy, and the racism. Those are important things, I think, to raise, but not to raise in saying, you evil, posh people, but to understand it and think, what a close-run thing.
But these are all what-ifs.
Yeah, well, of course they're what-ifs.
In a way, I think, I mean, as a dramatist, you're fascinated by what-ifs. As a historian, it keeps one on one's toes intellectually as a historian to be thinking about these as moments that when the hinge turns or doesn't turn. And even if, as a historian, I don't make it into a matter of drama in the way that you do, I think it's one of these things where a dramatist and a historian do have things in common. Questioning assumptions about our role in the Second World War provides rich territory for historians and dramatists alike.
The British met the challenge by throwing in everything they had.
I think that us standing alone is such a pivotal part of our psyche. There was Churchill, the bulldog, and we were standing up to tyranny. And of course, nothing should detract from that, which was indeed a very heroic moment. But because we weren't invaded, unlike a lot of Europe, we haven't had to face up to a lot of the things that were going on up to the beginning of the war and happened immediately after the end of the war. That finest hour covered up all sorts of things that are, if you like, our darker moments in history that see us in our worst light.
I suppose, as a historian rather than a dramatist, I feel that is sadly the nature of history, really. That sense of moral legacies which are never properly settled and which are there, which poison successive generations afterwards.
I think that nothing should take away from us standing alone. As a Jew, I realise how incredibly important that was to me being able to sit here. But these images of our ingenuity, our pluckiness, the fact that we somehow scraped it together to resist this tyranny, has taken away from a lot of the underlying truth about how lucky we were that history turned out that way.
I think we both have a sense of trying to encourage people to think outside the standard given accounts of our past. And certainly for me, I think one of the important points is to try and get people to think less narrowly nationalistically about hoardings. That if we get to the document, then we've got to the truth. Is that a fair summary of how you view history and documents and the documentary base of history?
Well, I think that there are a lot of documents we still haven't seen in our history, which is we're a very, very secret society. I mean, that's always interested me. I think that probably if one really, really wanted to burrow through the skirting of various British institutions, one would unearth things that not necessarily out of paranoia or maliciousness have been kept away from the public gaze, but through sheer, that's what we've always done, habit.
There are files in the Foreign Office that tell exactly what happened next. How we missed an incredible opportunity. Who was responsible? I need to see those files because I feel this may be a story I want to tell the public.
Harold obviously wants to expose a big truth that has not been shared with the members of the public. I think that it's not just the document, but it's the document making into the public domain.
I've always said to students, you've got to read between the lines of a document. You can't just read what's there. So I feel that a historian and a dramatist have, in a sense, a certain common ground in that you want the documents to help you evoke the time, and I want the documents for a similar purpose, but I also think there is an element of empathy and even imagination that the historian has to use in order to bring those documents to life.
Yeah, I think that the dramatist obviously is inventing and using guesswork to try to get time travel and to create a story. The historian also has to back instincts about once he's presumably studied closely a character. But obviously, the rows and arguments and quarrels of history are rarely recorded.
What you're saying is that's something that wouldn't necessarily be there raised explicitly in the historical record,
exactly,
but which you, as a dramatist, can take the liberty of opening up for us as viewers to think about.
Exactly.
Poliakoff has always walked a dramatist's tightrope between fact and fiction. But does he really think either of us, the dramatist or the historian, can ever actually get to the truth? We talked earlier about T-force. Let's also just talk about the other T word, truth. That's, in some areas of historical writing these days, a little contentious. There is the idea that, in a way, historians construct a truth or a story, a narrative, evoke a culture. They don't go for something objective called truth. Truth seems to matter to you, is that right, as a dramatist, and your treatment of history?
Well, I wouldn't claim to be a sort of dedicated seeker after truth. I'm creating fiction, so there's a contradiction there. But I think that as a dramatist, if you get really interested in a story, you can say, feel you're back there. This isn't the whole truth. Of course it's not the whole truth. How could it be? But follow me down this particular avenue, and it may make you feel interested and different about a particular moment in history, but also about how we are as people, and what made us, because ultimately all history is leading to what we are now, and therefore if you're using history in drama, you're trying to open doors to that and say, well, this is also what made us.
Stephen Poliakoff, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Close to the Enemy continues next Thursday night at 9. More on that in a moment. And you can watch the series so far on BBC iPlayer. Next up tonight, a look back at the 4th round action highlights from the UK Snooker Championship.
He's a scientist. Brilliant, apparently.
Get him to work for us. Doesn't matter how I do it.
And we're down we go. You may be bringing people over here who did things during the war.